The morning Richard Holt was escorted out of Meridian General Hospital, he was still wearing his badge lanyard. Nobody had thought to ask for it. That detail would matter later. Richard had been awake for 51 hours when the new hospital administrator Sandra Voss walked into the data center at 6:43 in the morning and found him face down on the desk between two server rack monitors, his reading glasses still on, a cold cup of coffee beside his left hand. She stood in the doorway for approximately 4 seconds. Then she called security. She did not ask what the screens were showing. She did not ask why a man in his mid-50s was sleeping in a room full of active monitoring displays at dawn on a Tuesday. She had been at Meridian General for 11 days and had already identified what she called the culture of comfortable exceptions. People who had been allowed to bend rules so long they had forgotten the rules existed. The sleeping man fit the image she had been hired to correct. That was all she needed to know. Richard lifted his head when the security officer touched his shoulder. He came up slowly, the way people do when their body is disputing the command. His eyes were red at the edges. He looked at the monitors first, reflex before recognition, and then at the officer, and then at Sandra, who was standing near the door with her arms at her sides and the expression of someone who has already decided. He said her name. He said the word system. He got approximately that far before she told him she did not need his explanation and asked the officer to collect his badge. Richard looked at the nearest screen for one moment. He looked at Sandra. He said one sentence plainly without drama. The surgical routing bridge is running on a manual bypass. Do not touch the failover switch. Sandra told the officer to proceed. Richard Holt left Meridian General at 7 minutes past 7 in the morning. He had been at the hospital for 2 days and 3 hours without leaving. His car was in the staff lot, and it took him a full minute standing beside it to remember where he had put his keys. Meridian General was not a small community clinic. It was a 400-bed regional medical center that handled everything from routine cardiac procedures to trauma surgery to complex oncology cases. The hospital had undergone a technology consolidation the previous year, folding 3 separate legacy systems into a unified patient data and surgical coordination platform. The integration had been messy in the way that all such projects are messy, full of compromises and workarounds and decisions that made sense in isolation and created fragility in combination. Richard Holt understood that fragility better than anyone at the hospital, including the people who had signed off on the architecture. He had spent 22 years in hospital IT infrastructure, the last 9 at Meridian, and he held the title of Senior Systems Integration Engineer. The title described perhaps 30% of what he actually did. The rest was the institutional knowledge that cannot be written into a job description, which legacy data paths were load-bearing, which failover procedures had quietly stopped working after the last update, which backup systems would cascade if the primary authentication layer hiccuped at the wrong moment. He was 54 years old. He had been a widower for 6 years. He had a daughter, Iris, who was 9, and who lived with him in a house that was slightly too large for 2 people, but that he had not moved from because it still held the shape of the life they had shared before her mother got sick. Iris was observant in the way that children are when they have learned early that paying attention matters. She noticed when her father did not sleep. She noticed when he ate standing up over the sink. She had a stuffed dog named Circuit that she had named herself at age 4 after walking through her father's office and hearing the word on a whiteboard. She had been carrying Circuit when he left for the hospital 2 days ago. She had been asleep when he left, so he had not said goodbye. Sandra Voss was 42. She had been recruited to Meridian General from a hospital network in the Midwest, where she had successfully restructured 2 underperforming facilities into profitable operations. She was sharp and fast and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from being right often enough that you stop fully examining whether you might be wrong. Her mandate at Meridian was explicit: cut inefficiency, raise standards, rebuild the culture. The board had been direct about what they wanted, and Sandra had been direct about what she would deliver. She had not been given a thorough operational briefing on the technology infrastructure. That had been scheduled for her 3rd week. 4 days before Richard fell asleep at his desk, a routine security scan of the hospital's network flagged something that did not look routine on closer inspection. It appeared in the authentication layer of the surgical coordination platform, a cluster of login attempts from internal service accounts that had been dormant for 14 months. The attempts were not aggressive. They were methodical, the kind of low-frequency probing that automated threat detection is specifically designed to miss. Richard saw it on a Friday afternoon and understood what he was looking at within an hour. Someone had gotten into a decommissioned service account with residual access to the platform's scheduling and routing layer. From there, they had been quietly mapping the architecture, identifying which internal systems the account could touch, how far its permissions extended. They had not triggered anything. They were waiting. The timing suggested they were looking for a high-activity window, a moment when intervention would cause maximum disruption and be hardest to trace. Richard escalated to the IT director, a man named Leonard Foster who had been managing the department through the transition, and who was, by any fair accounting, managing more than was reasonable for one person to manage. Foster listened, understood the severity, and asked Richard to begin containment quietly. The public relations problem of a security incident during a leadership transition, Foster said, could make things significantly worse if it got out prematurely. He was not wrong about the optics. He was wrong to let the optics determine the response. Richard did not argue. He began building containment around the compromised account, rerouting its residual access through a monitoring layer he constructed manually, setting up detection tripwires along the paths the intrusion had been testing. He could not take the platform offline. The hospital did not have that option. Surgeries were scheduled. ICU systems were running. Patient data was routing through the platform continuously. Stopping it would have meant stopping procedures in progress and disrupting care for people whose lives depended on the system being available in the next hour. He worked through Friday night and into Saturday. He slept 4 hours on a cot in the server room while a junior technician monitored the tripwires with instructions to call him if anything changed. It changed at 3 in the morning. He was up by 3:04. By Sunday evening, he had built a temporary isolation layer around the compromised account, constructed a manual routing bridge for the surgical coordination pathway, and identified the mechanism the attacker was planning to use. It was elegant in a cold way. A dormant payload embedded inside the platform's routine maintenance protocol. When the platform ran its standard overnight defragmentation process, something it did automatically every 72 hours, the payload would activate and redirect a subset of surgical scheduling data to an external endpoint while simultaneously locking the hospital's backup access to patient records. The defragmentation process was scheduled for Wednesday night. Richard documented everything. He built a consolidated log file with timestamps, a plain summary of the threat, and a set of explicit instructions for what not to do. The most critical instruction was at the top of the document in text 2 sizes larger than everything else. Do not run the manual failover on the surgical routing bridge. Do not initiate system restart on the authentication layer. The payload activates on restart. If I am unreachable, call me before touching either of these. He had written his personal cell number below it. He planned to hand the document to Foster in person in the morning and walk him through it step by step. He planned to request an immediate briefing with whoever was the appropriate executive contact. He put his head down for a moment while the overnight log compiled. He did not come back up. Sandra had been scheduled to tour the data center as part of her operational review. She had moved the tour earlier because she believed in seeing things unfiltered, before departments had time to prepare for a formal inspection. She had not expected to find anything useful. She had not expected to find a man asleep. She had not expected a great many things about that morning, and the morning was not finished with her yet. After Richard left, the data center returned to its normal rhythm. The technicians on shift finished their handovers. The dashboards cycled through their automated checks. The isolation layer Richard had built held quietly, absorbing the irregular traffic, keeping the intrusion contained without triggering any visible alerts. To someone who did not know what they were looking at, the system appeared to be running normally. Sandra spent the morning in back-to-back meetings with department heads. She was crisp and specific about her expectations and unapologetic about the pace of change she intended to maintain. Some people left those meetings feeling the clarity they had been told to expect from new leadership. Others left with a concern they could not locate precisely. Nobody in those rooms had enough understanding of the infrastructure situation to know that the concern was warranted, or that the reason they felt it was walking out of the building at that moment in a rumpled shirt with someone else's coffee stain on his sleeve. In the IT department, 3 of Richard's colleagues had already pulled up the documentation folder he kept on the shared drive. His files were organized in the dense, abbreviated shorthand of someone who documents for themselves rather than for an audience. The warning annotations were visible, but the full meaning required context that only Richard fully held. A junior technician named Priya pulled up the manual routing diagram and spent 40 minutes trying to understand it well enough to know whether she was looking at a problem or a precaution. She could not tell. Leonard Foster sent Richard a message at 11:15 asking him to call when he was available. He did not yet understand what had been fired along with Richard. He was beginning to. Shortly before noon, the surgical coordination platform began showing latency in its scheduling relay. Appointment confirmations were taking 12 to 15 seconds instead of 2. The on-call systems technician, a careful and experienced man named Derek, recognized the pattern as memory congestion. He had resolved it this way a dozen times. He prepared a targeted restart of the scheduling relay subsystem. Priya was at the terminal beside him. She said it quietly, not quite loudly enough, the way you say something when you want to have said it but are not sure you want to be heard. He told us not to restart anything. Derek paused for half a second. He's not staff anymore. The restart executed at 11:58. Richard had driven home without fully registering the drive. He remembered the turn onto his street more clearly than the 20 minutes before it. His neighbor had Iris. He had called from the parking lot to say he was coming. Iris met him at the neighbor's door with Circuit under her arm and the assessment gaze of a child who has learned to read her father's face for information before asking questions. She did not ask questions. She took his hand and walked home with him. He made her a sandwich and watched her eat it and answered her questions about whether he was hungry, whether he was tired, and whether the bad thing at work was fixed. He told her he had done everything he could. He told her he was going to rest. He sat down on the couch and Iris set Circuit beside him with the deliberate care of someone leaving something important in a trusted place, and by the time she had walked to the kitchen for a glass of water, he was already gone. The restart of the scheduling relay triggered the dormant payload at 11:59. For approximately 90 seconds, nothing visible changed. Then the authentication tokens for the surgical coordination layer began failing to synchronize. The first sign was a cluster of appointment records entering an error state, not deleted, not confirmed, simply suspended in a status that the system could not resolve. The manual routing bridge Richard had constructed disappeared from the active network the moment the relay restarted and cleared the memory state where his temporary logic had been running. The isolation layer fell with it. The payload activated its redirect pathway. A subset of scheduling data began routing toward an external endpoint. The backup access protocol, finding the bridge gone, attempted to reroute through the primary authentication layer and failed. The system began generating cascade errors across interconnected modules. Surgical pre-op confirmations for afternoon procedures could not be verified. ICU monitoring feeds began showing intermittent dropout flags. The pharmacy routing system, which linked to the coordination platform for medication verification, started queuing requests it could not complete. The technicians in the data center worked with speed and focus. They attempted rollbacks. The rollbacks found no stable restore point because Richard's bridge had never been entered into the formal system log. It had been a live construction, built and maintained in memory, documented only in his personal notes. They attempted to isolate the affected modules and found that the interdependencies were not mapped anywhere the team could access. Richard's documentation described the failure with accuracy that was almost painful to read in real time. Understanding it well enough to reverse it was a problem of a different magnitude. Foster called Sandra at 12:22 and asked her to come to the data center. She walked in and found a room that had been transformed since the morning. The displays were predominantly red. People moved between stations with the tight urgency of a group managing something too large to name plainly. 3 enterprise clients who used Meridian's scheduling system for affiliated clinic referrals had already called. 2 surgical prep teams had flagged that they could not confirm afternoon procedure clearances through the platform. A senior technician named Marcus walked her through what had happened. He was steady and direct and looked like a man who had decided to say the accurate thing regardless of consequences. It looks like he had the whole system in a controlled hold. We pulled the thread he was holding. Sandra asked whether they could restore it. Marcus said they were working on that. She asked who understood Richard's patch architecture. The answers she received described a gap that had been invisible until it became a crisis. The team understood the documented system. Richard had been maintaining something that existed alongside the documented system, an adaptive layer built from 2 decades of institutional knowledge about how this specific infrastructure actually behaved under stress, as opposed to how it had been designed to behave. Those were different things, and the difference was currently expressing itself across every red indicator on the board in front of her. She asked where his documentation folder was. Derek showed her. She sat at an open workstation and read through everything Richard had written. The file was dense and technical and written in the compressed language of someone working fast without time for revision. But the summary section, written in plain language at the top, was clear. The warning at the bottom of the final page was clearer still. Surgical routing bridge is on manual bypass. Do not initiate restart on authentication layer or scheduling relay. Payload activates on restart. I need to be contacted before anyone touches either system. Call before you act. There was a number below it. Nobody had called it. Sandra sat with that for a moment. Around her, engineers worked the problem as hard as it could be worked, and the problem was not moving fast enough. She read the summary again. She thought about the morning, the monitors she had not looked at, the sentence Richard had begun and she had not allowed him to finish, the specific look on his face when he said it. She had not misread the urgency in it, she had declined to read it at all. She picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang 4 times, no answer. She dialed again, 4 more rings. She called Foster and asked for Richard's home address. It took several minutes to find. She picked up her keys. The drive took 19 minutes. The neighborhood was the kind of place where families lived rather than where people demonstrated that they had arrived. The house was a 2-story colonial with a bicycle in the driveway and a basketball hoop that had not been adjusted down from adult height. Sandra sat in her car for a moment, registering the ordinary texture of a life she had not thought about that morning when she made her decision. Then she walked to the door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened and a girl stood in the space it revealed. She was 9 or so, with the slightly windswept look of a child who had been inside all day and was wearing her hair accordingly. She had a stuffed dog tucked under her arm. She looked up at Sandra with a gaze that was calm and assessing and considerably more composed than the situation warranted. "Are you from Dad's work?" Sandra did not answer immediately. She had not known there was a child. Richard Holt existed in the professional context as a name on an org chart and a problem she had resolved at 7 in the morning. The child in the doorway was a category her decision that morning had not accounted for. The girl Iris held the door open wider after a moment. Inside the house, Richard was asleep on the couch in the same clothes he had been wearing when he left the building. His reading glasses were still on his face. A mug of tea he had apparently made and forgotten was on the coffee table, cold, untouched. A throw blanket had been placed over him, precisely and carefully, the way a child places a blanket on someone they do not want to wake but cannot help caring for. Iris lowered her voice without being asked. "He's been awake for a really long time. He told me something bad was happening at the hospital. He said he fixed it before he had to come home." She said it with the matter-of-fact gravity of a child who has heard this kind of thing before and has learned to hold it without letting it show that it is heavy. Sandra looked at the house, the organized simplicity of it, the evidence of a life structured around one child and one job and very little else. The absence of decoration that isn't functional or personal. A drawing on the refrigerator held with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. A small pair of sneakers by the door, laces still tied from the last time they were taken off. She thought about every assumption she had carried into the data center that morning, the image she had constructed in under 10 seconds. The certainty she had felt while constructing it, the completeness of how wrong it had been. She asked Iris gently whether anyone was with her. Iris said the neighbor, Mrs. Kim, was coming at 4 and that she was fine until then. Sandra looked at Richard on the couch. She thought about going back to the hospital without him, about what the next 4 hours would look like if she did, about what her engineers would say at the next status check. Then she crouched down slightly so she was closer to Iris's level. "I need to talk to your dad. It's important. Can I wake him?" Iris looked at her for a moment with that specific child's assessment that adults spend their whole careers learning to produce and never quite manage. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that means "I don't love this, but I understand." It took 4 attempts before Richard surfaced. He came up through layers, blinking, hands moving first. When he registered Sandra standing in his living room, he went very still. The expression on his face was not anger and it was not fear. It was the exhaustion of a person who has just been handed one more demand they are not sure they have anything left to meet. He sat up. Sandra sat in the chair across from him and did not build toward anything. "I fired you before I understood what was happening. That was a mistake and I'm sorry for it. But I also need to tell you that the system is failing. They restarted the scheduling relay. The payload activated. Nobody in the building has your patch architecture." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Just closed them, nothing more. The particular heaviness of someone who hoped to be wrong and was not. He reached for his laptop on the side table and opened the remote monitoring dashboard. He read the metrics for less than a minute, then set it down. He did not speak immediately. He looked at Iris, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor nearby with Circuit in her lap, doing something with a notebook and not pretending she wasn't listening. He asked her whether she had finished her reading assignment, whether she had eaten the leftovers in the fridge, whether she knew Mrs. Kim's number by heart in case she needed it. Iris answered yes to all 3 with the patience of a child who understands the ritual and is not going to make it harder. Something moved between them that required no words and no audience. Richard looked at Sandra. "There are patients at that hospital whose procedures depend on systems that are currently failing. That's the reason I'm going back. I want that understood, not the job. not the apology. He stood, he changed his shirt. He said something quietly to Iris that Sandra could not hear, and Iris nodded once and put circuit in the side pocket of Richard's work bag. Just the head sticking out, and he let her. He looked back at her from the doorway. Iris held up one hand. The gesture of someone who had done this before and knew how to let it be what it was. They drove back in Sandra's car. Richard had the laptop open on his knees and was already mapping the state of the system, his hands moving with the efficiency of a person who has been rehearsing the recovery plan for 2 days. When he walked into the data center, the room changed in the specific way that rooms change when the person who knows what to do comes through the door. Not celebration. Something more like a collective exhale from a group that has been managing above capacity for too long. Richard moved directly to the primary console. He asked for a full current log dump, architecture diagrams, and a verbal account of every intervention since the restart. He listened without interrupting. When the account was finished, he was quiet for approximately 6 seconds. Then he started distributing the work. He sent Derek and Priya to begin a controlled isolation of the redirect pathway, rerouting the compromised traffic into a contained observation environment rather than blocking it outright, which would alert the attacker and potentially trigger a secondary mechanism. He put 2 engineers on constructing a parallel authentication bridge to restore surgical coordination access through a pathway the compromised account had not mapped. He asked a 3rd team to begin manually verifying the afternoon surgical confirmations and flagging any that could not be confirmed through alternate channels. He asked someone from administration to contact the 3 affected surgical prep teams directly with a scripted message that acknowledged a technical issue without triggering protocol escalation. He asked one person to do nothing but log every command he issued, in order, with timestamps. The distribution of work was its own kind of answer to the day. He was not managing from a position of leverage. He was executing a recovery architecture he had been building in his head for 48 hours, calibrating it in real time against a situation that had deteriorated further than he had prepared for. He understood this system the way long contact produces understanding, not as it was designed but as it had become. He knew where it bent before it broke. He knew what it would tolerate. He knew the places the documentation did not reach because he was the one who had quietly been there when those places became relevant. Over the next 2 hours, the cascade slowed and then stopped. The redirect pathway was severed from the authentication layer. The corrupted payload was identified, isolated, and neutralized through a sequence of 22 targeted configuration changes that closed the access point and removed the attacker's established foothold. The parallel bridge came online and restored surgical coordination routing. The afternoon procedures cleared. ICU monitoring feeds stabilized. There were losses. 3 smaller scheduling batches would require manual reconciliation. 2 referring clinics would receive formal incident disclosures. The security audit that followed would be thorough and costly. But the catastrophic outcome, a sustained disruption to hospital operations during active patient care, with data exfiltrated to an outside party and systems locked against recovery, had been prevented. When Richard confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized and the attacker's access was permanently closed, he leaned back in the chair and said nothing for a moment. The room released something that had been held for most of the day. Sandra had stood at the edge of the working area through the entire recovery, not directing, not asking for updates, simply present in the way a person is present when they are watching something unfold that they caused and cannot undo and do not want to look away from. The emergency review met within the hour. It included Foster, department heads, the hospital's legal liaison, and the board's operations representative. The incident report was presented in full and without softening. Richard had identified the intrusion 4 days ago. He had escalated it through proper channels and been asked, effectively, to manage it quietly. He had worked for 2 days maintaining a compromised live system without backup, without adequate sleep, and without the authority to bring the situation to executive leadership directly. He had been terminated before delivering a single complete sentence of his briefing. His explicit warning about the restart had been dismissed. The restart had been performed. The result had been exactly what he predicted. The careful language of institutional accountability began to appear in the room. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, transition circumstances, shared responsibility across multiple decision points. Sandra recognized the language because she had used it herself in other settings. She understood its function. She understood that using it now would be a direct repetition of the same failure that had produced the crisis. She stood. This morning I removed a person from this building without allowing him to say what he needed to say. I did that because what I saw fit the conclusion I had already reached. I was wrong, and what followed was a direct consequence of that. I am not here to distribute that responsibility. It belongs to me. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when something accurate and costly is said without qualification. Richard at the far end of the table gave one small nod. He did not perform forgiveness, he did not offer warmth for the room to observe. He received the apology as a person receives something that is true but cannot undo time, with a stillness that was neither cold nor warm but simply honest. In the weeks after, the board moved on Richard's standing with the directness of an organization that understood what it had nearly lost. There were offers of promotion, a new title with real authority over infrastructure security, and compensation that more accurately reflected the role he had actually been performing for the last several years without a title that acknowledged it. What he negotiated first was not any of that. He asked for a formal escalation protocol that guaranteed frontline engineers a direct path to senior leadership when reporting security or safety concerns, a path that could not be blocked at the management layer. He asked for mandatory rest rotation standards in the data center, making it structurally impossible for any single person to become a solitary point of failure through exhaustion. He asked for explicit policy protection for engineers who raised risk alarms, so that raising an alarm carried no professional consequence regardless of how inconvenient the timing was. He presented these requests at a board session attended by people who understood that they were in the presence of a man who had been handed significant institutional leverage and had chosen to spend most of it on protections for the next person who would someday be in his position. Sandra accepted every item without amendment. The change that mattered most was not written anywhere. It lived in the way Sandra moved through the hospital after that. Her decisiveness stayed, her standards did not soften, but she had developed a specific new habit. Before acting on what she saw, she asked what she did not yet know. She arrived in departments not to inspect but to listen. She learned to recognize, with increasing reliability, the difference between people who spoke loudly about their value and people who were quietly holding something critical together. It was not a skill she had come in with. It was one she had paid the full price to acquire. Several weeks after the incident was formally closed, Richard was in the main hospital lobby with Iris, who had come to meet him at the end of his shift because they had a standing agreement on Fridays. Iris was telling him something about school with the emphatic velocity that 9-year-olds bring to the subjects that matter, and Richard was listening with the complete attention of a man for whom that conversation was the exact right size of the world at that moment. Sandra came through the lobby and saw them before they saw her. She stood back for a moment, registering the difference between the man she had observed under pressure and the man she was watching now. The face was entirely different, not controlled, not precise. Simply open in a way that the data center had not produced and could not produce, lit from somewhere that professional competence does not reach. She walked over after a moment. She was not carrying an agenda. She had found Circuit in her coat pocket 2 days after visiting the house. She had meant to return him sooner. She held him out to Iris, who received him with the specific delight of a child recovering something that had been worried about. Richard looked at Sandra. There was nothing unresolved in it and nothing performed. It was the look of two people who had arrived at honesty from opposite directions, through a collision neither of them had chosen, and who were standing on the other side of it in a lobby on an ordinary Friday afternoon, trying to figure out what that meant. There was no clean conclusion to hand them. There was the light through the lobby windows. There was Iris tucking Circuit into the crook of her arm with the satisfaction of a completed transaction. There was the end of a long week and the beginning of whatever came after it. That was enough. For now, it was exactly enough.